Welcome to episode 5 of the Robot Report podcast, which brings conversations with robotics innovators straight to you. My name is Steve Crow, editor of the Robot Report. I'm joined as always by senior editor Eugene Demetri. Gene, how are you, sir?
I'm good as always. Happy July, everyone.
How's good old Waltham treating you today?
It's good. I wish I could walk to all the robotics companies that are within a stone's throw here. The weather is nice. I'm good to go.
Yeah, I'm not sure we'll be visiting those companies anytime soon, but we'll get into that in a little bit. New episodes of the Robot Report podcast drop every Wednesday. We can be found now on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, basically anywhere you can get your podcasts. So please subscribe today. Leave us a rating. It'll help others find this podcast. Today, we have a great interview with Chris Thayer. He's the president and CEO at Motive Space Systems. They're a California-based company that's developing ground and space robotic systems. We talked to Chris about the evolution of space robotics and how Motive is working specifically to lower the cost of such systems. Chris was also the vice president and GM of MDA for about 8.5 years. MDA is a world leader in the development of space robotics. So a great conversation with Chris and Gene. I know you studied space policy in college, so this was particularly fun for you.
Yeah, I'm definitely, I've been for many years, had a strong interest in space exploration and technology. And so getting to meet the people, sometimes it is actually rocket science, getting to talk to them is always interesting.
When we start sending humans to Mars to populate other planets, are you going to be first in line? Would you do that?
If they would let me, I would.
I wouldn't. I'm a little. If I was guaranteed to come back, maybe I
Oh,
would do that. But
unfortunately, I don't know that they can guarantee that.
yeah, yeah, I'll pass. But our conversation with Chris is coming up in a little bit. But first, Gene, we're going to look back at some of the more interesting stories for the first half of 2020. I can't believe the first half of the year is already over. And, to me, a couple of the more interesting stories happened just last week. And the big one here is Amazon acquiring Zoox for reportedly $1.2 billion. There were rumors that these two companies were in conversations for a couple weeks. And finally, Amazon pulled the trigger last Friday, and Amazon said it will work together with Zoox to design autonomous ride-hailing vehicles from the ground up. There were earlier rumors that suggested maybe Amazon will use Zoox's technology to deliver packages instead of people. But for now, the official statement coming from Amazon is that they're going to use Zoox's technology for the, quote, future of ride hailing. Do you buy that? I mean, what do you think Amazon's play is here?
So, it's really interesting. I think people have to realize that Amazon is more than just delivering packages, right? They've got AWS, there is all of these different plays that as a now megacorp that it's getting into. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It is, on par with something like Google or Facebook or Uber. I think diversifying their autonomy play is probably a smart move. Obviously, ride hailing has taken a huge hit in the meantime because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But when it inevitably bounces back, if Amazon has a foothold in there, it's smart because that technology, as you noted, can also still play back into autonomous vehicles for delivery or for other functions.
Yeah, to me, it's got to be logistics. I think, the more that I speak with, folks who are developing, level 5 autonomous vehicles for ride hailing applications, it's just nowhere near ready, right? And a lot of them, you've heard it referenced as the greatest engineering of our time, I think is what Kyle Vogt of Cruise has said. But a lot of people are now saying, when I talk to them anyway, if this can be solved, level 5 is, whatever, 10, 15 years out. So to me, it's all about logistics for Amazon. And, Amazon also has Blue Origin. We're talking about space robotics today a little bit later on. They have, that company as well. But if you look at Amazon's shipping costs, it's ridiculously high. They spent in 2018 about $27.7 billion on shipping. That was an increase of $6 billion or about 30% over 2017. And to put that into perspective, Amazon spent more on shipping alone in 2018 than Starbucks, another Seattle mainstay, reported in revenue for all of 2018. And when you look at some of the other investments into the autonomous vehicle space that Amazon has made, Aurora Innovation, right? Amazon was part of their $350 million Series B in 2019. Uh, Amazon is invested in an electrical vehicle company, Rivian, that makes zero emission trucks, right? So when you're trying to put all these pieces together, it has to come back to logistics. I mean, I know Jeff Bezos has a pretty big ego and he competes with Elon Musk and all sorts of different things, but I agree with what you're saying about Amazon has other business, but at the heart of it, I think they are a logistics company, and you know autonomous vehicles, whether it's trucking or ride hailing, it's still a lot of it is a logistics operation, right?
Right, and I think you're absolutely correct in that Amazon is looking at this as getting all the pieces together. That rather than try to work with outside partners that are does not have any kind of influence over, why not work with people that you've invested in and help bring up from the ground up and say, okay, we want autonomous vehicles for these different purposes. We're not going to work with Uber, right? They're not going to work with, and so it totally makes sense that they are working on all the different elements, whether it's electrical, autonomy, navigation, ride hailing, all of those different elements.
I mean, do you even know where Zook? I mean, where would you put Zooks? And I don't even have a real tremendous knowledge on their ride hailing tests and all that. But if you look at what they got to be way behind Waymo. They got to be behind Cruise. Aurora Innovation, which we'll get to momentarily. They've been doing this since 2016 with Chris Urmson, who's one of the, I would say, pioneers of autonomous vehicles. It just doesn't make sense to me to go the ride hailing direction with Zooks.
Well, again,
I
I
mean,
think what
Zooks is also in trouble, right? I mean, they have reportedly stole some IP as well, which has gotten some other folks in the AV space in trouble.
there's a lot of contention. We talk about how the robotics industry is by and large very collaborative, very collegial, but in autonomous transportation, it's very cutthroat, and that's why you're seeing these lawsuits. That's why you are seeing, and I think some of them, are going to be legitimate. That they've have found people stealing IP from one another, but it's also because the prize is huge. And so, even right now, when investments have been down across the board in technology, why are people still spending billions of dollars on autonomous vehicles, ride hailing, electric vehicles? It's because they know that rider habits are changing, driving habits are changing. They're probably going to accelerate and change because of people realize that they can telecommute or that they don't like dealing with more and more traffic. And so, if people are successful, they get the right combination of an app and ride hail and transportation on demand. That potential market is billions of dollars, and no one has yet gotten the silver bullet or the magic formula for success there because they know the autonomy part is in some ways the hardest part that's taking a while. But if they can get those other elements like the ride hailing, like the um, supply chain management, all of those things, they can combine them well. And I think Amazon has a good bet at doing that.
Yeah, think about micro fulfillment. Amazon owns Whole Foods now. They acquired that a year or two ago for a boatload of money.
Yep.
Maybe it helps. Delivery services for Whole Foods. There's just so many different ways that they could go. But before we move on, did you see what Elon Musk called Jeff Bezos on Twitter? Did you see this?
He said it was a copycat, which is again, there's a lot of trash talk, and um, I certainly remember the days when it was uh, Microsoft versus Apple or IBM. There's in technology. Again, we think of everyone as being white collar and very nice and polite, but the gloves are off. I think we definitely are going to see in the next few years really vicious competition to capture this market of transportation. And again, we're talking goods, people, services, the whole nine yards. And people can fully integrate that. And again, we've been talking for a while. AI is great and robotics are great, but when you combine them and you're able to apply, an app where you have a service on demand with something in the physical world, that market we haven't even seen its full development yet. And who knows? These people are the ones in the lead right now, but I would not be surprised if through mergers and acquisitions, that field becomes very dynamic.
So as of us recording this podcast, Jeff Bezos has yet to respond to Elon. But you got to love Elon. He even threw an emoji of a cat in there. So there's nothing better than a fight amongst two of the world's richest men. So we'll keep an eye on and see what happens and see if Bezos responds. But another development that happened last week. There is some talk, Gene, about the robo taxi bubble. I don't know if necessarily an autonomous vehicle bubble because of the delivery services and the trucking applications that are continuing to be in development. But a big story happened last Thursday. Aurora Innovation, which was founded in 2016 in part by Chris Urmson, who again is one of the pioneers of self-driving cars. He's been working on the technology since the early 2000s. He studied it at Carnegie Mellon University. He was involved in the DARPA Urban Challenge. He took over for Sebastian Thrun to head up the Google self-driving car project for several years. But last Thursday at an event, Aurora Innovation said for the first time that it is now prioritizing the development of autonomous semi-trailer trucks over autonomous cars. And here's a quote from Sterling Anderson, who's a co-founder and chief product officer at Aurora. He said, if you want to get to market with a safe system quickly, you can do no better than to start in trucking. And just another sort of background point here. Anderson was once the head of autopilot at Tesla. So he's been involved in, robo taxis for quite some time as well. But to me, this is another sign that Amazon, again, they're a major investor in Aurora. Aurora had a huge round in 2019. Now they're moving over to, testing and developing self-driving trucks. Is this simply a play to be acquired by Amazon? I mean, they just see what happened with Zoox. Is this just a play for them to be acquired by Amazon at some point? Is this an admission that robo taxis aren't close? What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. I think the fact that many of the people pursuing autonomous passenger cars have had to realize that it's a little farther out, or level 5 autonomy is a little bit farther out. And so if they still want to get investors or they still want to get acquired, they have to be realistic. I don't think anyone is going to be willing to invest money in a company that says, oh, we're going to solve this problem tomorrow. And in fact, the reason why big companies like Amazon are making these investments now is that they may be thinking, oh, we can get in cheap, we can get in at the ground floor before these companies are valued at $1 billion each. And I've talked before, and you've talked before about how autonomous trucking, in particular, especially long haul trucking, you're on long stretches of highway, particularly in countries like the U.S., where it's not as challenging an environment as in urban centers. That people have told me at the major automakers that if you can start with long haul trucking and you still have humans directly involved in getting into and out of cities, getting into and out of distribution centers, then you get to cities where the weather's always nice, like in California or the Southwest. Or then you work up to cities where the streets are a little more crowded, like Boston or Chicago or New York. And then finally, you go to cities that are much more chaotic, much more dynamic, like Mumbai or Rome. And if you can work your way up, you can still provide services along the way and make money along the way to fund all that research. And so I think starting with long haul trucking, we've seen a number of companies that have done fairly well in that and that are doing tests around the world. I think that is, in some ways, we're more likely to see autonomy there, where you have caravans, essentially taking the idea from trains, putting that on the roads, rather than individual passenger cars in a host of environments.
Yeah, I just wonder if investors are getting impatient too. I mean, um, raising, there's several of these autonomous vehicle companies that have raised billions of dollars, over the years. And, you know, what do the investors get in return for that? Maybe what, 15, 20 years down the road when fully self-driving cars are here, maybe then they get their money back. But it seems like a crazy amount of time to wait. And I just wonder, it's just a very interesting industry, right? These
It is.
companies, right? Did the folks developing these autonomous vehicles, did they did they really think that robo taxis were something that was viable in the short term future? Did they just see this as an opportunity? You
Well,
know, to
a year or two ago, people were promising that they would have fully autonomous vehicles within 5 years. If you were to ask any of the major automakers or any of the major AI tech companies now, they would they would probably not be quite as bullish. But in the meantime, you're right. A lot of investors are committed, and they're looking for some results, any results that they can say, okay, we're at least a step closer to commercialization, and we're obviously not there yet. Which is also why you see a lot of investment in, the delivery robots, because they're like, well, if we're not going to have autonomous trucks, maybe we can start smaller. And so there's a lot of questioning that, again, maybe it's not a bubble per se, but there's certainly that trough of disillusionment where
right,
everyone
right,
thought this was coming, and now they realize, oh, it's actually quite a bit harder than that.
right. Yeah. Before we move on, I just want to plug. We had a conversation with Gautam Narang. He's the CEO of a startup called Gatik. They're developing level 4 autonomous vehicles for middle mile logistics. They most of the time restrict these vehicles to the rightmost lane, and they do that to take out some of the technical challenges that now a lot of these other AV developers are admitting just doesn't make this. You can't solve them 100% of the time, and so therefore these systems aren't safe to release to the public. But Gatik claims, they tell me that they're making millions of dollars in revenue every single year. Their main customer is Walmart, of course, the largest retailer in the world, and they work with several other Fortune 500 companies. And here's a great business case. They're not trying to solve the hardest technical problems. They're trying to just solve a problem with where the technology is at the moment. And 10, 15, 20 years from now, if level 5 is here, then they'll use that. But they're running a successful business based on within the restrictions of the technology at the time. So Gautam joined the podcast, I think, last week. So I'd encourage everybody to go back and listen to that episode. Obviously the elephant in the room that's impacting basically the entire world is the COVID-19 pandemic, the novel coronavirus. Um, I don't know what to say other than it's
Well, I want everyone. First off, I want to tell all of our listeners, we hope that you're staying safe and healthy. We hope that um, not only are your families and businesses surviving, but that we will get through this. It's encouraging to hear that some places in Europe and Asia are already beginning to reopen. I think, unfortunately, it's going to take a bit longer here in the U.S. or North America, but that is obviously the biggest story of any kind in the first half of 2020. But it has direct bearing on what's been going on in robotics and automation, because there is fallout. We ask everyone that we've talked to, how does it affect your operations? And most are like, well, we're able to do some development from home. But I think, as you've noted, we've had a robotics company, one of many here in Boston, in the e-commerce space, laid off about 20% of its staff recently. And then Bossa Nova, which is one of our RBR 50 Innovation Award winners, announced it let go, 61 of its
yep,
employees, so it's
yep.
about a third. And so that the fallout, no one is immune from it. No one necessarily knows, depending on demand. Even though we see e-commerce demand shooting through the roof, supply chains are attenuated, they're stretched thin, they're tangled up. We're seeing manufacturing took a major hit, with the automotive industry already having declining demand before this. Economists we talked to last year had already said we were heading for a regular cyclical recession. They did not expect COVID-19 to shut down the entire world almost at once. And it's going to take a while to bounce back from that. And so if you had enough venture capital, you might be able to keep going, but it's been a tough road.
Yeah, the thing that struck me about Bossa Nova was they had the announcement earlier this year, right, about expanding their partnership with Walmart, right?
Yep.
We had a great Robo Business Direct session with them a couple weeks ago. But to me, if you look at who now, that they're not really responding to any of the media reports that are out there about these uh, cuts in the workforce, but the departments that are the majority of these hits are affecting are the software and operations teams. Now,
Right.
when you look at this robot, it's basically a software system on wheels, right? It's a mobile software, a mobile data collection platform, right? So you would think the software team is quite important in continuing the development of this of these robots, and the operations teams running the company or deploying the robots. Everything everything to do with the company. When you see it's like that, it's not somebody in marketing, it's not somebody in PR. This is like the key operations, the key departments of the company. It's concerning to me when you see someone that's gotten a tremendous amount of press, including from us. They have this great partnership with Walmart. They're scaling up to 1,000 robots, which it doesn't sound like that's a tremendous amount when you compare it to other industries, but deploying 1,000 robots is pretty good in this day
That
and
is a
age,
lot. And
especially with one company. So I don't know. I think there is hope in the long term that the coronavirus is going to create a lot of opportunity for robotics companies. But yeah, I mean, this is proof right here that the short term might be challenging for many companies.
yeah, and we've talked already about automotive and logistics robots. I think there's been setbacks, obviously, for robotics events, setbacks for the hospitality industry, and yet at the same time, it shows when successful companies are cutting back that it is still a young industry. It is still there's some fragility in the economy where companies that you would think, like you said, because of software development, would be able to keep going, that they definitely have their own issues of trying to tighten their belt, and that affects a lot of people. But the upside of that is that those developers are now in the labor pool, right? And we've always heard how difficult it is to find good talent in the robotics space. And so those people will not, I'm hoping that they will not take too long to find other jobs at other companies. And so maybe that moving that talent around will help the space as a whole. And we have seen some areas where, at least in the short term, the crisis has actually helped. I mean, we talked about e-commerce robots. We've talked about telepresence in the past. Disinfection cleaning robots. There's a huge demand. There's a lot of players jumping on the bandwagon right now. When I talked with the head of Blue Ocean Robotics early on in the pandemic, he's like, "Yeah, everyone's trying to copy what we're doing," and I think they and ZX are the two of the leaders in this space. But they point out that if you had to add up all the hospital rooms in the world that need disinfecting, it's just a drop in the bucket. So even if they're trying rapidly to scale up and getting investment interest right now, it may take them years to catch up with the demand. And the big question is, will that demand taper off as the crisis ends? Or will people understand, oh, we can continue to use these robots and free up people for other things?
Yeah,
That's the big
to
question.
me, we don't need another disinfection robot. I mean, the amount, and you in particular have written about a lot of these things, and there's just so many of them. And I understand the demand is there, and scaling is a challenge for a lot of robotics companies, but there's just so many other problems, or opportunities, maybe is a better word, for robotics companies to help frontline workers deal with the coronavirus, right? I mean, robotics is great for what? Dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs, right? Well,
Right.
the nurses, right? The doctors, the people who are dealing with these patients on a daily basis. What are we doing? Are we doing enough? Are robotics companies doing enough to help protect them? So there was a great editorial earlier in the year in Science Robotics talking just about that, about, are there ways to help automate testing or, temperature taking, and just sort of remove the nurses and the doctors. Boston Dynamics had a great they did something at Brigham and Women's where they were using Spot basically as a telemedicine system, right? They put an
Right.
iPad on Spot, and the doctors and nurses could remote control the robot and send it out to the patients, and discuss symptoms and stuff like that with the patients without getting themselves in harm's way. We've seen Esben Ostergaard, co-founder of Universal Robots. He's now launching another startup called Lifeline Robotics, where it's a robotic arm that does a throat swab for you and sends it off to a lab to be tested. Now they're not doing, you know, everything that I've seen. The most effective test is done through your nose, right? It's not doing that as of yet, and maybe it's not capable of doing that. But I just think there's a lot of other opportunities, and I just don't want to see another disinfection robot.
Well, I think what has happened is that when people were rushing to find some way of responding to the novel coronavirus, anyone who had a mobile platform thought that sticking a UV light or a disinfectant spray on top of it would be relatively easy to do. And there's a couple of companies that were designing systems to do disinfection. That's what those systems were designed to do. Well, a lot of other companies said, "Oh, we have a robot for telepresence or delivering things, on a mobile platform. Why don't we have it do disinfection?" And again, that's not to say that that's a bad application, but that's a relatively easy one compared to, like you were saying, diagnostics, laboratory automation, actually helping doctors and nurses and hospital staffers with materials handling and things like moving patients around. Those are things that people have been developing for a while, but they're much harder. And I think we will see that. There's going to be greater interest in that in the longer term. This first wave, I think, is just part of the initial reaction, in much the same way that we saw a lot of interest in delivery robots. But that's by no means the only thing that we can do to respond to this crisis or to similar crises in the future. I do think that looking ahead, the one thing that COVID-19 pandemic has done, it has increased the awareness across the board, the general public and companies, of how automation can help things in a more realistic way than thinking, oh, we're going to get Rosie the robot. I think people are understanding now, oh, there is an area where we can start applying robots, and we don't have to be as resistant to them in the past as we were in the past. Because you know what, you're going to need social distancing for some time. You're going to need robots that can augment human capabilities and not replace them. We've heard a lot about reshoring. I've asked this question to a couple of our guests on this podcast. There is definitely an interest in the longer term in bringing back manufacturing with automation, but that won't happen overnight.
One of the robots I was bummed about to see get affected by the pandemic, iRobot. It's Terra robot lawnmower. They're claiming that the pandemic was the reason for this. I think their earnings were down. The Q1 2020 earnings were down. So as a result, they suspended. Here's a quote from them: "We suspended our go-to-market plans associated with our Terra robot lawnmower. Although we believe there is substantial long-term opportunity in the robot lawn care market, our decision to take our foot off the gas for Terra was based largely on the likelihood of significant delays to our 2020 commercial plans for Terra caused by COVID-19, combined with the overall intensity of ongoing technology investment." And they keep going on there. But, this is an interesting issue. They've been talking about this robot lawnmower for years. I think I've seen stuff going back as early as 2006, where they've been talking about a Roomba-like robot lawnmower. Everybody knows that this is something they've been working on for quite some time. They actually got to launching some trials in Germany last year. I would have been on I would have been on the bandwagon for getting one of these things. This is it's a great idea. I think it's something that a lot of folks, maybe it wouldn't really work for me because where I live, our yards are a little bit larger than if you're in a city, for example. But there is a market for this. I think some of the challenges are, with the tech, are getting them to stay within the yard and the boundary wires. They claimed iRobot that they had a better way of doing this with beacons that didn't require the wires to be wrapped around the yard and a perimeter to be set by the wire. Um, it's interesting. Their
Yeah.
revenue was down like 28% in the U.S. alone. So I understand why they did it. It's just a bummer.
Well, and as we said, there's a slowdown affecting everybody. It is really interesting that we think that the Roomba, which is arguably the most popular consumer robot of all time, just having that navigate around your house without bumping into things, without falling downstairs or getting lost or whatever, that took a lot of technology development to get to that point. And a lawnmower, you would think, would just be an extension of that. And in fact, it is a little bit harder again. And iRobot has made some great investments in AI and in more intelligent navigation. But I think they were, at this moment, especially when everyone's stuck at home, they're probably mowing their own lawns and not having to try and rush and do it in between rain and work. And so, maybe putting that off is wise, but I can't wait to see lawn mowing robots on a large scale. I can't wait to see snow shoveling robots on a large scale. So, like you, I'm looking forward to the day when that comes.
Yeah, and we're trying to book Colin Angle for an upcoming episode of the podcast. We're in touch with those guys, so hopefully we can get him on the horn, and we'll just see where they're at with the lawnmower, see if it's still part of their plans, which it sounds like it is. Let's shift gears. Let's get back to some positive things, some positive developments in the robotics industry. Boston Dynamics, they finally commercialized their Spot quadruped a couple weeks ago. We had Michael Patrick Perry from their business development team on the podcast a couple weeks ago. They've opened up sales just in the U.S. essentially. Spot comes at a price of $74,500. There's a whole boatload of accessories that are sold separately to augment some of Spot's capabilities, whether it's the level of autonomy or the level of vision that it has. And that was what struck out to me. I think I even asked Michael this question: is every article that was written about this essentially had the price right in the headline about oh my gosh, it's almost $75,000 for this robot, and I just don't know why people are so surprised by that. I mean, maybe they just don't follow it as closely as we do, but that price tag has come down significantly from what they reportedly said it would have cost years ago you know when it was still in development, right? So I remember, Gene, when I first got out of college, the first HD TV I bought, this was probably 2007 ish when HD TVs were relatively new. The TV I bought was $2,500, $2,500, and I can get that same TV today for like $300. So it's not an apples to apples comparison. Obviously, the Spot quadruped is a much more sophisticated machine than a television is, but they got to get these robots out into the world. They got to get the scale going. They got to get more customers, and eventually that price is going to come down.
Yeah, and we have to remember that this is a commercial robot. This is not a consumer robot.
Right.
So the people who are using this, by and large, are going to be developers. They're going to be construction firms. They're going to be, um, maybe a hospital or police department or something like that, emergency response, where there is a need for equipment. And they're looking at it as equipment and not as a toy. And it's hard to remember that sometimes because people watch the videos of Boston Dynamics legged robots walking, and they're great, they're cool, but these are not robots that are going to serve you iced tea anytime soon. These are not robots that are designed as toys. These are really meant to be put on a construction site or in a disaster area or in a hospital. And so, if you figure out what other equipment costs, this is actually relatively reasonable, and I'm excited to see more of them out in the field, really demonstrating new use cases.
Yeah, there aren't many. There's only two other quadrupeds that are commercially available that I know of. Animal C from Anybotics, I believe they're based in Switzerland, and then there's a Chinese firm called Unitree Robotics. They make a much lower cost quadruped called Alien Go. But as far as I know, that might be it. I mean, I'm sure there's several that are available for pure research standpoint purposes that go to universities and research labs and all that kind of stuff. But this is I think I wrote a story back in 2019 after the robotics summit that 2019 is the year of legged robots, right? Mark
Right.
Rayberg keynoted the show, and he said they were working on the production version of Spot. Agility Robotics, they have commercialized their bipedal robot Digit, maybe a little early in that prediction, but I'm excited. This is finally a chance to really see if there is or indeed a market for quadrupeds, right? So you see Spot right now; it's for site documentation and gauge reading and leak detection, thermal inspection, somewhat basic applications, right? But as they get these robots out into the world, into the hands of more people, they're going to come up with unique applications on their own. And one of the things coming down the pipeline for Boston Dynamics that literally is going to open the door to other types of applications for Spot is they're working on this manipulator arm Michael told us a couple weeks ago should be out in early 2021. There's some cool videos out there of Boston Dynamics employees and engineers who are working from home right now, like the rest of us, testing Spot with this manipulator. There's a video of it playing cornhole before they release. Yeah, before they release Spot, you saw the robot was using its manipulator to open doors and to help out another robot. So these things are coming. Mark Raybert was even he just spoke at a conference last week, and I think he's being genuine. He did say that at some point they do see these systems going into homes and helping people, or other types of environments where they are interacting more with people and trying to help them out, not just as tools for commercial facilities. So we'll see what happens, but it's been a long time coming. They're probably the most famous robotics company in the world, and they are just now releasing a product for the first time commercially. So we'll see what happens.
Well, and I think that again that demonstrates the reality of robotics versus the perception, right? People will see a video on YouTube and say, "Oh, look how cool it is that Atlas is doing somersaults, or that Spot can open a door." And again, there's the underestimate people underestimate how much work has gone into getting it to that point. I mean, we all remember the videos from the DARPA challenges of robots falling over trying to do simple tasks. And to get that to a point where one, it's reliable, two, it's affordable, and three, there's an actual use case for it. That takes time, and Boston Dynamics is now proving out some of those use cases. Eventually, over time, as the price continues to drop and the capabilities of the AI continue to get better, I think we will absolutely see more of them in more places.
Yeah, they've always pushed the envelope as far as what's possible with robotics, and they're certainly not going to stop doing that anytime soon. One story that I want to talk about, my personal favorite, Gene. I'm not sure if you have a favorite story that you've been a part of, that you've written or covered this year. One story that I covered was how former coal miners have been retrained to become mobile robot technicians. So, AutoGuide, a developer of autonomous mobile robots up near the Boston area, and its premier integrator, Heartland Automation, they've hired about, when I talked to them, it was about 25 former coal miners that have gone through this program in Kentucky, at the Haas E Kentucky Advanced Manufacturing Institute, and they've trained on some of the latest state of the art CNC equipment. They learned to program and set up and operate machines. They're now working at AutoGuide, building their mobile robots, and just a tremendous story. We kind of profiled it from the area of two of the gentlemen that have gone through that program. Matt Neese is one of them. He's 25, born in a very poor area of Appalachia, Whitesburg, Kentucky. Poverty line there is about 25% of the people live below the poverty line as of 2010. So we always talk about or hear about reskilling. Well,
Yep.
here's a great example of folks who are sort of down and out since the war on coal happened under President Obama. And kudos to Kathy Walker. She's the woman who is running the ECAMI Institute down in Kentucky. She's been in the coal mining business for many years herself, really giving these folks another opportunity, another chance at life, and trying to revitalize and reshift the economy down there in Kentucky. So that was a great story.
And it's interesting, and I totally agree that this is one of the most important stories of the first half of the year, not because it represents a huge trend, but because in this case, it shows the potential of the robotics industry to really help revitalize the economy. We've talked so long about the robotics hubs, right, or robotics clusters, which are great, and they help certain areas. But you also need to help areas that have not been so lucky over the past several decades as manufacturing, as mining, as agriculture have shifted around the world. And you're not going to turn back the clock on globalization, but you can intelligently uh, uh, build up your own talent. And when we're talking about reshoring production, when we're talking about retraining people, this is the sort of thing that needs to happen on a wider scale. And, I'm very encouraged when you see people who are in what we used to call blue collar jobs, right? Moving into jobs where they can still use their technical abilities or talents, but for the new economy. And we're not just talking about apps, making an app or making a social media thing, but really doing something that still involves using your hands, still involves the satisfaction of building something or helping to maintain something that is going to transform people's lives.
You hear a lot about in the mainstream media how robots are stealing jobs, right? Taking jobs, replacing people. Again, this is just a great instance of where these folks might be down and out if it wasn't thanks to robots, right?
Right.
So you don't really read too many of those stories. And I've been in touch with Kathy. She's going to come on the podcast sometime soon, but she has another similar program, I'm told, in the works, looking to reskill some other folks who could use some help. Gene, is there, not to put you on the spot, but is there a story that sticks out to you from that you were reporting on this year?
Well, I've done a lot on the disinfection robots, which I know you're sick of. But what was interesting to me is that as we put together this year's RPR 50 Innovation Awards winner list, that there is a lot of innovation happening, but not where you would think. So, despite all the money flowing toward autonomous vehicles, or despite all the interest in supply chain um, and mobile robots, the innovations that we've seen have been in things like healthcare. And to me, those are the ones that I find most interesting. The stories that I've written about robots that actually help people in hospitals. And, again, the disinfection robots are one part of that, but I'm much more excited at the idea of mobile manipulators that can actually help share that load because our first line healthcare personnel are under even more strain than they were before. And I know several nurses and doctors who have been working, around the clock, or they're working multiple shifts, some in the COVID wards, some in their regular jobs. And anything that helps people like that, I'm a big proponent of.
To stay updated on all these stories that we talked about, to check out the stories that Gene and I continue to write and some of our guest writers, make sure you follow our network of robotics sites. We got the Robot Report, Robotics Business Review, and Collaborative Robotics Trends. We're joined now by Chris Thayer, CEO of Motive Space Systems. He leads the company's work developing ground in space-based robotic systems and components. The company's work includes robotic systems for NASA JPL's Mars 2020 mission and the new Xlink space-rated modular robotic arm. Chris, thanks for being here, sir.
Thank you for having me.
I think it's official. You have the coolest job on the planet. You build robots for space. It doesn't get any better than that.
No, it really doesn't. It's exciting, especially exciting time with a lot of new applications and things growing in a lot of ways. So yeah, it's feel privileged to be able to do it.
Tell us a little bit about what Motive is working on.
So right now we just finished up the Mars 2020 robotic arm that you had mentioned, and we're waiting for launch in just a few weeks here, which is always an exciting time. And then, kind of coupled with that, we're launching a new product line for space robotics called Xlink, which is a modular system, which we really think will kind of open up applications for new markets and new space. And so that's a really exciting thing. Of course, we're always doing a bunch of other work in ground robotics and even lunar type rover applications that we're pursuing. But those are kind of the big things that we're working on right now.
I think a lot of our listeners are aware of the robotic arms that were on the space shuttle or helped build the International Space Station. How has Motive advanced the technology since then? Because, you know, most of us may not be that familiar with what's going on up in orbit.
Sure. Well, at first those robotic arms on the shuttle and on the station are certainly really iconic robotic pieces up in space, and they really blazed a trail for future space robotics. And they showed really what the value proposition of robotic manipulation in space can be. However, those systems they were very expensive developments, and they were developed decades ago. So certainly things are evolving and growing, and so we've been trying to develop new systems and things to make things more accessible to a broader market. Some of the technology bits that we've been working on are things like cold operable arms that can work at cryogenic temperatures, which are really important if you're going to go out to the Jovian moons, the icy moons, so down into minus 180 C and still operate. And then we've been doing a lot of development on the control electronics over the years and have a robust suite, really rivaling what you can even do on the ground. So that's something that we've really pursued a lot, trying to get advanced electronics into the mix of space robotics. Distributed control architectures for robotic arms, which is something that really can reduce mass and complexity of a system. Force torque sensors, which are obviously really standard things for ground robots, there really aren't a huge number of options if you're going to go into a flight scenario. So we've been developing those as well. Torque sensing in the actuation systems, and then modular and scalable systems, so that we can really address a number of different applications with essentially the same Lego bricks, if you will.
Gene and I write a lot about different verticals that use robots, right? We write a lot about the logistics market, using industrial robots or collaborative robots or autonomous mobile robots. And those are all pretty competitive spaces. We're talking with you from Motive. I know Maxar was recently selling its space robotics company, MDA, for close to $1 billion, I believe. Just, Chris, take us inside the space robotics industry. How competitive of a space is that?
Yeah, it's an interesting space for sure. No pun intended. I think one of the things, it is a very competitive market. All markets that are actually in existence tend to be that way. And the reason that it's competitive, there are only a handful of companies that can actually address these domains, but also historically there are a very few number of opportunities, and so you are competing in a kind of make or break system for all of these different opportunities in the past. So it is very much a competitive space, and one of the reasons that there are so few opportunities, at least in my mind, has been the kind of astronomical price of robotic systems of the past. So that's something that it just definitely makes sense in certain applications to have very bespoke systems. But we kind of think there's maybe a new way to look at this, and by actually reducing the price, open up people that couldn't have done this before. And so, we actually think that if you reduce the price of a robotic system, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but you won't have robotic spacecraft. You'll just have spacecraft with robots on them. And it's kind of that order of operations that has got people tied up in the past. So if you're going to make a mission, it's a robotics mission. Well, no, it can just be a regular mission. You just by a normal course, you just have robots on board to do different activities. So that's kind of, as we view the world, and of course that will lead to further competition. But for us, I think that's a good place for us to be.
I studied space policy back in grad school, and we talked a lot about different types of missions. Can you describe some of the range of customers that we're talking about here? Because if you're talking about commercialization of space, are you talking about, for your arms, government missions, scientific missions, commercial missions, military missions, all of the above? Are you at this point looking to be agnostic as far as that goes?
Yeah, so actually, right now we're pretty fortunate to be working in all the areas you mentioned. So commercial, civil, military, all have space robotics applications. And I do. One of the things that's happened over the years, I think it's the nature of our online ordering penchant is more and more across the board. Everyone wants to be able to just put something in a cart and buy it. Doesn't quite work like that, but I think there's a definite trend where everyone's kind of converging to wanting a more productized solution. So while each of those customers or potential applications in commercial, civil, military all have unique needs, and certainly, they're not all the same. That commonality of requests for most people is something we're starting to see in terms of capabilities. And the other part that's great is robotics tend to be more of a general purpose tool. So you can adapt them to do a wide number of different tasks for different people without having to completely, start from a clean sheet of paper. So, we're working on things like, the space exploration side, whether it's the moon or Mars, or the icy moons, comet sampling, satellite servicing is obviously something that's active and something we're pursuing. On-orbit manufacturing and assembly is really starting to grow a lot right now in terms of application space, and that's something we're excited to be in. Satellite tug, so moving satellites into different orbital positions or debris removal. So the systems that we try to build, one of the philosophies we've always had is as we develop products or go after projects, we want to make sure that they're building blocks for future capabilities, so that they all gel into a future vision for how we want our systems and our future capabilities to look like. So we try not to go after dead end opportunities or technologies. We want to make sure we're always building so that we have a more robust ecosystem of robotics parts and on the shelf here.
I was reading the announcement of the Xlink modular robot arm a while back, and it seems to have a variety of use cases. Can you just talk about what are some of the things that it's intended to do, or what are some of the things it's capable of doing while in space?
So the modular system is certainly, we can do things like replace segments on orbit and do things along those lines. But the core value proposition for that system is getting the cost and lead time of a robotic system down. So we can reconfigure a robot for a particular customer, especially I would say a lot of the new space customers, they have not been in a project formulation, if you will, stage for years and years and really have the requirements down. They're moving pretty fast. They've got a concept. And it's pretty hard for them to say on day one, this is exactly the system that we need. And so there's a lot of collaboration and back and forth. Well, part of that means you have to have a system that's capable of being flexed into a different space or use case. And sometimes that means a different, very simple thing is a length of reach. So my first use case, I thought it was a meter, and now it turns out I need 3 meters. What do we do? Well, if you have a modular system, then you just change it. You don't have to redesign everything from the ground up. So we kind of we realized that certain things in that topology, if we change that design, we could inexpensively adapt to new mission configurations and really without a penalty to the customer, which is not the same way that things would have happened, a few years ago. So that allows us to really adapt to customers' needs and changes as it grows.
So speaking of trying to get out into space affordably, there's always problems with minimizing power and mass, and obviously keeping the price down because every ounce adds, a launch load. How do you keep the price down for Xlink?
It's kind of an interesting story. It's really the genesis of that product is kind of it's multifaceted. So we've been working with a few customers on their space robotics applications and using kind of a classical approach to that we had used in the past. And it was really hard for us to close the cost model for their business case using that. And starting from a thing and then trying to make that thing cheaper is a very difficult thing to do. And you can cut around the edges and compress to an extent, but it becomes really difficult at some point. So now, if we flash backward in time, when we formed Motive, we also started our ground robotics effort kind of at the same time, because we thought we could bring some of the lessons we had learned from years of space robotics into the terrestrial robotics market. And that ultimately led to the creation of our RoboMantis platform, which is a modular system that is very robust and capable, but it's a ground robot. So we sort of had this aha moment where we realized that we could backflow that technology back into the space side from the groundwork that we had done. And so we started with a fresh sheet of paper and said, well, let's rethink what a space manipulator can be and what are the problems we've experienced over the years. And let's start from the perspective of saying we need to have, we really want to have not ones or twos of things, but hundreds of things on orbit or in space in robotics. So how do we make that happen? And by and large, the biggest drawback is always the cost of the system. And so we put that kind of at the forefront. We said when we would make a decision about a part or a component or a design, the first thing we say, does this fit the cost model? And that really drove to some interesting design choices. And one of the big things that we did was we said, well, we want to make sure we have essentially the same design from our lab arm, which is very inexpensive, which is kind of almost the price of a commercial arm you would buy, all the way to a super high reliability, radiation hardened 15-year geosynchronous orbit arm, without changing the configuration or the interface. And so we built the whole thing from the ground up with the cost in mind, which is not, I would say, not necessarily typical for a lot of space missions. It's more typical for a commercial product that you're trying to build, as you develop that. So in addition to the system just being cheaper in and of itself, we also thought about the whole system problem, the life cycle of that product. How do we make the life cycle of that product cheaper? So we can reduce the test and integration time for a spacecraft, and reduce the in-lab cost for getting your project started. Because most projects start in a lab trying to do some demonstrations, and then eventually that kind of builds and builds until you actually have a flight mission. So we tried to step back and holistically look at what it would take, and that's kind of what we did to get the price down. Really was re-architecting everything from the ground up instead of trying to shave dollars and cents from certain components.
We're talking with Chris Thayer, CEO of Motive Space Systems, which is developing ground and space-based robotics systems. I want to get your thoughts on what are the main technical challenges of building such a system for space, and the environment that they have to operate in.
Sure. In essence, I've always said engineering's engineering. And so you no matter what engineer you are, you have a set of requirements for your environment. And so I've worked in the past on underwater robotics, and those certainly have different sets of requirements than space. But one of the big problems historically has been especially for robotics, because as we all know, operating robots is typically very intensive operation from both the power and computation standpoint, data transfer, all these things. And so that's been one of the difficulties over time. So we really tried to build from the ground up on trying to say, well, how can we leverage new technologies into the system, and try to make things as robust as possible. For different environments, you have different problems. So just because you leave Earth doesn't mean it's always the same thing. So if we're on orbit, if we're in low Earth orbit where the space station is, that's a fairly friendly environment with low radiation, and that's one thing. And and how you do your thermal management there is different than, say, how you would do thermal management on Mars or on the moon. And sealing is another good example of that, where in the lunar environment, if you're the actual regolith on the moon is very abrasive. And so that's something you have to really plan for. Whereas you're just looking for contamination if you're on orbit, so you don't really have the same sealing requirements. So there's kind of a wide variety of requirements, depending on where you're headed to. And the big thing for us is you can't go fix it, right? So once you build it and you launch it, that's it. There's no going back and I need to resolder that connector. No, it's a one-way trip. So you do have to be very diligent up front with that one-way trip that it's going through. So,
what's the testing or the simulation process like?
At the outset, we're huge proponents of the concept of creating arms that are 1G testable, meaning we can test those arms and all their use cases here on Earth to validate operations. Now you do get some, gravity sag due to that, which is why you can recalibrate on orbit or on the planet. But generally, that's negligible. There's an old adage in space flight: it's test as you fly as you test. So we'll take a system through a very, very structured test program, which include static loads testing to simulate use cases. So if you're taking a core of a rock on Mars, you'll simulate that load into the arm. We do go through a vibe test where we put the whole arm and its electronics and everything on a shaker table and do vibration testing to simulate the launch environment. Which typically is one of the more harsh load cases that you'll see. We'll do thermal vacuum testing to simulate operations in space. And then, in extreme cases, if you're really worried about, certain thermal extremes, you can have a sun simulator in that thermal vacuum test to really exercise hardware. So, and then there's all sorts of other, testing that you do that's maybe more on the prototype level, where if you have a new seal, let's say, and you want to test that for lunar regolith, you'll do component level testing to really exercise at that level to make sure that you're not gonna break something or not live up to your the lifetime that you're designing for.
So, Chris, how much are you mentioned before all the component technologies, how much are you waiting for enabling technologies such as motors, motion control systems, and all of that? And how much are you building yourself? Are you using any kind of off the shelf gears, or are you doing everything in-house?
So that's a good question. I think we try to, we're a small business, so we try to use all the tools that we can at our disposal to get where we're going as fast as we can. And certainly we are always looking for new things. I'd say it's probably a little of both. We're looking for new technologies and waiting for new things to happen, but also trying to make sure that we can innovate and use things that don't exist. One of the things that happened, very recently, and this is for our Xlink product. There was a certain chip that we have used a lot for a lot of our motion control systems. But when we put it through that rubric of saying, does it hit the cost? It didn't hit that, and it was too big for the space that we needed it in. So we actually set out to develop our own with our own algorithms for that chip. And so, because there was no better way to do it. So I'm always going to look for the best way to get it done. And I have no pride about it being my solution or someone else's, as long as it gets the job done. But sometimes you have to make your own solution when it doesn't exist. And we've done that with cold electronics, where we wanted to have them operate without heat down at minus 185 C, which is pretty novel and doesn't have a lot of applications here on Earth, but It's going to be enabling in some of the polar regions of the moon, or on Enceladus, or Europa. So those are things where we're always trying to um, build those technologies around kind of a vision of what we want to do, and then trying to uh, fill the card in with all the different technologies we need. So yeah, it's a big deal, and I think one of the hardest things that's still out there is computation.
Hmm.
You know, there are solutions, and we make things work, but it is always, I'd say, it's still the biggest challenge, especially if you're looking for a radiation hard system. So that's something that's still that it still needs work to make it easy. You can just go right now and buy an industrial computer, and I can run anything on it, and it works great. But that isn't the case for space. You have to be pretty smart about how you do your control algorithms, especially vision processing. We use a lot of stereo vision and fusion of lidar sensing and stereo, and that is very computationally intensive. So yeah, that's something I'm looking forward to.
We've had the good fortune of seeing Robomantis at shows, and we know that Motive is working on ground-based robots. What did you learn about developing the arm for the Perseverance Mars rover? And is there any relationship between like lunar or planetary exploration and your ground-based robots?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, first off, it's always exciting and a huge honor to get to build like an arm, like such an iconic piece of robotics hardware. So that's something that never you never kind of get used to that. It's something that's always a thrill. Um, so one of the things that was interesting when we actually won the contract to develop that 2 meter arm for the Mars rover, there were a bunch of unique challenges that had to be met. Um, the, the Perseverance rover is actually a first step in a process to bring samples from Mars back to Earth, and that led to certain flow down requirements for the arm compared to the last Mars arm on the Curiosity rover. So our payload capacity increased by 50%, from 30 kilograms to 45 kilograms of the turret out on the end of the arm, which is sizable. And our positional accuracy had to improve by more than a order of magnitude. And we needed to build and design a 6.4 stroke sensor. And we needed to do all that without changing the size or weight of the arm. So even in that scenario, we still had to kind of reinvent a few things in terms of how we would approach building that robotic system. Um, with respect to kind of our ground side, we do see a lot of similarity. And JPL is also doing work in these limbed systems like Robomantis, and we collaborate with them. Um, Going to places like the moon right now, that's definitely the hot topic right now is getting back to the moon, and especially when you start talking about extreme access into a variety of terrains on the moon, things like Robomantis, where you have these wheel on limb systems that are high degrees of freedom systems, that allows you to do a number of different things and go and see and explore different areas than you could with more of a classical wheeled approach to a rover exploration. So while they are different, we certainly the experience is the same team is doing all of those things. So there's a lot of cross pollination, if you will, between the projects and the way we approach problems, the way we solve problems. And so it all is reinforcing, if you will, and that's the whole story of we thought we were going to bring the space down to the ground, but then we ended up bringing ground back to the space. And I think that flow back and forth is really healthy, because it also means that both sides can innovate. I think for a number of years, the space market was getting pretty, I don't know what the right word is, it was getting a little old in terms of its technology and its desire to see new innovation. Several years back, that was certainly the case, but now you don't see that. You see, a desire and execution of bringing new technologies into that space environment, which is great. And it's also nice to see things from space like they did in the 60s, making their way from space down to the commercial market too. So it's a good flow of those two environments.
After all this, obviously, we're also still affected by things here on Earth. Um, in terms of the whole COVID-19 pandemic, how much has that affected your operations or you personally?
Yeah, so it's certainly been a interesting transition. The personal side, having running a school at the house has been an interesting thing. Um, and at work, it's also been kind of an interesting transition. From an infrastructure standpoint, fortunately, we had all the systems in place to make a conversion. So when we got the first safer at home direction from California State, um, we actually had our company operating remotely within a few hours. So we
Wow.
were we were able to kind of flip a switch, and everyone just dispersed. And I was actually shocked at the ease of that. By the end of the day, I was like, "Well, we're actually operating." I'm kind of surprised. Um, and so it just showed the robustness of the systems that we already had in place, which was not because we were visionaries. It was just part of our normal workflow, and we flexed those out, and it worked great. We've had to learn new ways of interacting and operating with 95% of our people working remotely. Um, but surprisingly, we made it work. I think financially, we were in a good position, um, which fortunately, I know, unfortunately, a lot of companies um, aren't in that position. So I know it's been a really rough ride for a lot of people. But for our employees and what we do, we've been weathering the storm well. I think the flip side is we're trying to see how we might take advantage of this. So obviously, this was kind of a huge operations experiment that I never would have dreamt of running on my own. But now that we've done it, the question is, what can we learn from it? Are there ways to operate differently or better, or will more remote work, the telework, will that become the norm? I tend to think so. I was probably on the fence, on the side of the fence, saying, we need everyone to be co-located. We don't want to have remote working. I was probably biased more in that direction, but I think that going through this process, we've learned a new way of operating, and I think also it speaks to the fact that the tools are much better now than they would have been 10 years ago. Um, but at the end of the day, we make robots, so there's going to have to be some hands on the hardware. So there'll have to be a good balance of that going forward. But there really is no definitive end in sight for this kind of work environment. So we are trying to figure out how we grow and add staff in an environment where you can't be in the same location. So
Right.
really challenging, but I think we have a pretty good handle on it right now.
So we talked about a lot about lowering the cost of space-based robotic systems, and really sort of revolutionizing space technology, which certainly reminds me a lot of the recent successful SpaceX launch. They're doing similar things by reducing the cost of spaceflight. But in general, what are your thoughts of that launch and what they're doing for space technology?
Yeah, I think the launch was exciting. It's been a long time. I think it was great to see astronauts being launched from our shores again.
Hmm.
It's been far too long, so that was great. Um, the other side is, getting back to that the kind of new model and how we're interacting with a lot of different customers, whether it's military, commercial, civil. Um, along those lines, this is a great example of the public-private partnership model, and how that can be a successful and sustaining model going forward. So that's been great, and in a lot of respects, I think SpaceX has done what a lot of companies do when they want to, and this is obviously going back several years, but when they want to start something in an industry that already exists, you clean off the table and you start with a clean sheet of paper and you go, I'm going to build it for this application. I'm going to put in my own rules, and I'm going to make it successful. So that's been great, and I think that's something that a lot of companies are doing, and it's something for sure that we did with the Xlink. Um, and I think the other thing is it just shows what sticking with a vision for a long time can do. So that wasn't because they started, wanting to launch astronauts, 2 months ago. They wanted to do that 10 years ago, or whatever the time is. And so that perseverance is critical for that long-term success. Just keeping at it, and really, um, you know, having that public-private partnership where you can have the sustainment of a private company with direction towards a specific goal for over a decade. That's critical because if it's just a public situation, you can have administrations change, you can have political winds change, and different priorities can come and go. But having that partnership where you have a shared goal and a shared vision, that's really powerful.
So speaking of shared visions and looking into the future, what's your favorite robot, real or fictional?
Okay, let's see. So I'm gonna cheat and I'm gonna say two, and the I'll probably go. They'll both be fictional,
Okay.
and they're from my childhood because that's kind of I think those are the things that kind of last with you. Neither one is a great movie, but the first one is a friendly robot. It's Johnny Five from the movie Short Circuit.
It's a great movie. Come on.
Come on, and yeah, so that was always fun. And then the second one is more sinister and probably a little more. I don't know that anyone would know it, but it's Maximilian from the movie The Black Hole.
I remember that well. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's that floating red robot,
Great
which was
styling. Great styling. I know you worked on race cars. It had that kind of race car vibe to it, right? Like a muscle car vibe to it.
yeah, it was very that was a cool movie. It was one of the scarier movies you can watch when you're a little kid. So that was great. But no, I think and when we design robots, we try to take a little bit of. I had an art minor, so I try to add a little industrial design to all of our systems, and it does go a long way. So and that's probably from that kind of trying to make an iconic or memorable robot too.
Well, make sure you keep us posted on future updates on how you guys are doing. So, Chris Thayer, CEO of Motive Space Systems, just know you've made both Gene and I, especially Gene, quite jealous today from this conversation. Uh,
Yes.
thank- Thanks so much for joining us. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, guys. It was a pleasure.
Gene, any plans for the fourth?
Well, I wish I could say there were robots in my plans. I may do some binge watching over the weekend, but I'm actually looking forward to kicking back, watching some concerts, and recharging because even though we're all at home, it is really an opportunity to sort of reflect on where we want to go going forward. Because our country's been through some tough times, and it's really now that we appreciate our families and our friends, no matter where they are. And so I'm hoping not to blow anything up over the long weekend.
Yeah, actually got a chance to go down to Cape Cod over the weekend with the family. So went to a beach a couple times. It was there was a lot more people there than we thought. We were still able to socially distance, but it was somewhat bizarre, but at the same time brought back somewhat of a sense of normalcy. Right. So every year at this time we head down to the Cape for a vacation and get to enjoy the beach. But So it brought back a little bit of normalcy. So it was pretty good to see. So, well, whatever you're doing, Gino, obviously do it safely. That's going to do it for episode 5 of the Robot Report podcast. Thank you to Chris Thayer, President and CEO of Motive Space Systems, for joining this show today. And thank you to everyone who listened. New episodes of the Robot Report podcast drop each Wednesday. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Smash that subscribe button and leave us a rating. For Eugene Demetri, I'm Steve Crow. Have a great 4th of July weekend, everybody. We hope you and yours are celebrating safely, and we'll talk again next week.